Thomas stood at the kitchen counter staring blankly at the coffee maker as it gurgled and hissed. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the empty dining table where no one had sat opposite him for 3 years now. He hadn't moved any of her things. Her favorite mug still hung on its hook, gathering dust. The house felt too big, too quiet, like a museum dedicated to a life that no longer existed. The coffee finished brewing, and Thomas poured himself a cup, black and bitter just as he'd grown accustomed to drinking it. Once upon a time he'd added cream and sugar. Lily had teased him about his sweet tooth. "You're drinking dessert?" she would say with that smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. Now the bitterness suited him better. Thomas checked his watch. 7:30. Time to head to the architecture firm where he was senior partner. Work was the only thing that made sense anymore. It gave structure to his days, filled the hours with drawings and meetings and client calls. His colleagues had stopped asking if he was okay. They'd stopped suggesting he get back out there, or mentioning the name of some nice woman they knew who was also single. Instead, they treated him with a careful politeness that sometimes felt worse than outright pity. He grabbed his laptop bag and car keys. Another day, another dollar, another distraction from the constant ache in his chest. The firm was bustling when he arrived. Thomas nodded at the receptionist, a young woman whose name he should know by now but somehow never remembered. He walked straight to his office, closing the door behind him before anyone could rope him into morning small talk. "Tom?" A knock at his door. His business partner, Doug, poked his head in. "Got a minute?" Thomas nodded, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Doug sat down, straightening his tie. "The Robertson project. They want changes to the atrium design." "Again?" Thomas pulled up the blueprints on his computer. "We've already revised it twice." "Yeah, well, Mrs. Robertson saw something in a magazine." Doug trailed off, studying Thomas's face. "You look tired, man." Thomas ignored the comment. "Send me their requests. I'll look it over." "Will do." Doug hesitated, then added, "Some of us are grabbing drinks after work. You should come." Thomas gave a non-committal shrug. They both knew he wouldn't show up. After Doug left, Thomas immersed himself in work. He lost track of time until his stomach growled, reminding him that people typically ate lunch. He unwrapped the sandwich. He'd packed that morning, the same turkey and Swiss he brought every day, and ate at his desk while reviewing project timelines. The hours passed in a blur of client calls and design tweaks. Before he knew it, the office had emptied out. His colleagues headed home to families or friends or whatever filled their evenings. Thomas stayed, as he often did. The cleaning crew had grown used to working around him. Around 9, he finally shut down his computer and headed home. The house was dark when he arrived. No lights left on. No one waiting up. Thomas microwaved a frozen dinner and ate standing at the kitchen counter, scrolling mindlessly through news on his phone. A headline caught his eye. "Keanu Reeves speaks about loss in rare interview." Thomas paused, then clicked. He'd always respected Reeves as an actor, but lately he'd found himself drawn to interviews with the man. There was something about Keanu's demeanor, a quiet sadness behind his eyes, a thoughtfulness in his responses that felt genuine in an industry built on facades. The interview was recent, Keanu promoting his latest film. The interviewer, trying to dig for emotional content, had brought up Keanu's past losses, the death of his child, his best friend River Phoenix. Thomas expected the actor to deflect, but instead, Keanu took a long pause before answering. "Grief," he said in the video, "is like carrying a weight that never gets lighter. You just get stronger at carrying it." Thomas felt something stir in his chest. He rewound the clip and watched it again. "People expect you to move on," Keanu continued, "but that suggests leaving something behind. I don't think we move on. We move forward and we bring it with us." Thomas sank onto a bar stool, dinner forgotten. This man, this celebrity who could have any comfort money could buy, was describing exactly what Thomas had been unable to put into words. The constant presence of loss, the way it colored everything. He found himself watching more interviews, clips from different years. In one from several years back, Keanu was asked what happens when we die. His answer was simple: "I know that the ones who love us will miss us." Thomas felt tears welling up, the first he'd cried in months. It wasn't just what Keanu said, but how he said it, without drama or self-pity. just a quiet acknowledgement of human connection and what it means to lose it. By midnight, Thomas had fallen down a rabbit hole of Keanu content. What struck him most wasn't the actor's philosophy on loss, but how he'd continued to live despite it. How he still found joy in his work, in riding motorcycles and being kind to fans and crew members. The man had endured tragedy but hadn't been consumed by it. Thomas looked around his kitchen, at the unwashed dishes piled in the sink, the collection of empty takeout containers, the layer of dust on the countertops. When had he stopped caring about his living space? When had he stopped caring about living at all? He took his plate to the sink and for the first time in weeks actually washed it instead of adding it to the pile. It was a small thing, meaningless really, but it felt like movement. That night as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Thomas thought about what his therapist had told him years ago, in those raw first months after Lily died. Grief isn't something you get over, she'd said. It's something you learn to carry. He'd quit therapy after 6 sessions. He didn't want to learn to carry his grief. He wanted it gone. But 3 years later, here he was, still bent under its weight. Thomas closed his eyes, Keanu's words echoing in his mind. You just get stronger at carrying it. Sleep didn't come easily these days. Thomas often lay awake until the early hours, his mind cycling through the same well-worn paths of regret and longing. Tonight was no different. He thought about the morning of Lily's accident, their argument over something so trivial he couldn't even remember what it was now. How she'd left for work without their usual goodbye kiss. How he'd been in a client meeting when he got the call that would shatter his world. If he'd driven her to work that day, like he sometimes did. If he hadn't been so stubborn about whatever stupid thing they'd fought about. If he'd just said I love you before she walked out the door. These thoughts had become his nightly companions, more familiar than any human presence in his life. Around 2 a.m., Thomas gave up on sleep. He went to the living room and turned on the TV for company. A late-night showing of The Lake House was playing, one of those romance movies where time and love bend the rules of reality. Keanu Reeves starred alongside Sandra Bullock. Thomas had never seen it, but he left it on, the soft dialogue filling the empty space around him. He must have dozed off on the couch because suddenly the movie's emotional climax was playing out before him. Keanu's character waited at a restaurant for a woman who didn't know yet that she was meant to meet him. The loneliness of that scene, the patience and faith it portrayed, it cut straight through Thomas's defenses. As sleep finally pulled him under, Thomas found himself thinking about faith, not in God or destiny, but in the simple human ability to endure. Keanu had endured. Maybe Thomas could too. His last conscious thought before dreams claimed him was a question he hadn't asked himself in years. What would it mean to truly live again, not just survive? He didn't know the answer. But for the first time in a long time, he wanted to find out. Thomas woke with a stiff neck and the TV still flickering in the dark living room. The credits of The Lake House rolled silently. He must have hit mute in his half-sleep. His phone showed 4:17 a.m. Too early to start the day, too late to hope for proper rest. He dragged himself to bed, collapsing onto sheets that hadn't been changed in weeks. Sleep came surprisingly quickly this time, pulling him under like an ocean current. And then he was dreaming, not the usual fragmented images or rehashed memories of Lily, but something vivid and strange and completely new. He stood at the edge of a lake, water lapping gently at worn wooden boards beneath his feet. The dock stretched out before him, sunlight dancing on calm waters. It looked like the lake house from the movie, but different somehow, more peaceful, more real. The air smelled of pine and fresh water. Thomas walked to the end of the dock and sat down, letting his feet dangle above the water. The sun felt warm on his face, a sensation so real he could almost believe he wasn't dreaming. Beautiful, isn't it? Thomas turned at the voice. A man he didn't recognize sat beside him. He hadn't heard anyone approach, yet somehow wasn't startled by the company. The stranger wore simple clothes, jeans and a faded t-shirt. His hair was shoulder-length, dark with touches of auburn in the sunlight. His skin was olive-toned, his beard neatly trimmed. Nothing like the pale, flowing-robed Jesus from the paintings in Thomas's grandmother's house. Yet somehow Thomas knew exactly who this was. The knowledge settled in him without question or doubt, as things often do in dreams. "Am I dead?" Thomas asked. It seemed the logical conclusion. The man laughed, a warm sound that rippled across the water. No, Thomas. Very much alive. Then I'm dreaming. Yes, Jesus said simply. But that doesn't make this conversation any less real. Thomas nodded, accepting this dream logic. Why are you here? Why me? You've been carrying something heavy for a long time now, Jesus said, looking out across the lake. 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days. Thomas felt a chill despite the warm sun. The exact time since Lily's death. Your pain still aches, Jesus continued. And last night you finally asked why. Had he asked that? Thomas couldn't remember forming the question, but he had wondered why the grief hadn't dulled with time like everyone promised it would. I don't understand, Thomas said. Are you saying there's a reason it still hurts this much? Jesus turned to look at him, eyes deep brown and somehow ancient. There is. You haven't forgiven yourself. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He looked away, focusing on the distant shoreline. There's nothing to forgive. I didn't cause the accident. No, Jesus agreed. You didn't. Then what? Your last words to her were in anger. Thomas felt his throat tighten. It was just a stupid fight. About dishes or something. I don't even remember. It was about her mother's birthday dinner, Jesus said gently. You didn't want to go because you had a project deadline. The memory flooded back, Lily standing in the kitchen, hurt in her eyes. You never make time for my family, she'd said. And he'd shot back something dismissive about her mother's passive-aggressive comments about his work hours. You think you don't deserve peace because your last moment with her wasn't loving, Jesus said. And every day since then you've punished yourself for it. Thomas felt tears welling up, real tears, though he was still dreaming. She died thinking I didn't care. She didn't think that. How do you know? Thomas demanded, sudden anger flaring. How would you know what she thought? Jesus didn't flinch at his tone. Because I was with her, Thomas. In her final moments. Thomas stared at him, anger draining away as quickly as it had come. She thought of you, Jesus continued. Of your first date at that Italian restaurant where you both ordered the same dish. Of the night you proposed on the Ferris wheel even though you're afraid of heights. Of how you always warmed her side of the bed in winter. Each memory was like a knife to Thomas's heart. Precious moments he'd locked away because they hurt too much to remember. Her last thought wasn't about a morning argument, Jesus said. It was love. Just love. Thomas covered his face with his hands, shoulders shaking. He hadn't cried like this since the funeral. Jesus waited, a steady presence beside him. When Thomas finally looked up, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, the sun had shifted position, Dreamtime moving strangely. Your pain honors her, Jesus said, but it was never meant to replace her. I don't know how to let it go, Thomas admitted. The guilt, the grief, it's been my companion for so long now. Without it, I'm afraid there will be nothing left of her. There will be everything left, Jesus countered. All the love, all the joy, all the ways she changed you for the better. They sat in silence for a while, watching an osprey circle above the lake before diving for fish. Why now? Thomas finally asked. Why this dream now? Jesus smiled. You started asking questions again. Started looking outward. He nodded as if referencing something. That actor you watched, he understands loss as few do. Keanu, Thomas said. Yes. He carries his grief with grace. It doesn't consume him, but he's different. Stronger, maybe. Jesus shook his head. Not stronger. Just further along the path. He's learned what you're beginning to learn. That grief transforms but doesn't have to destroy. In the distance, Thomas noticed a small boat approaching the dock. A figure stood in it, face obscured by sunlight. Is that? Thomas couldn't finish the question. No, Jesus said gently. You're not ready for that reunion yet. You have more living to do first. Disappointment and relief mingled in Thomas's chest. Will I remember this when I wake up? Parts of it enough. Jesus stood, offering his hand to help Thomas up. Watch those interviews again. Listen with new ears. Thomas took the offered hand and rose to his feet. The touch felt impossibly real. Warm skin, calloused palm. Thank you, he said, though it seemed inadequate. Jesus smiled. For what? It's your dream, is it though? Thomas asked. Instead of answering, Jesus looked toward the approaching boat. It's almost time for you to wake up. Wait. Thomas had 1,000 questions suddenly. How do I move forward? What am I supposed to do? Start small, Jesus said.
Clean your house.
Call her parents. Open the box of photos you hid in the closet. These were such simple, practical suggestions that Thomas almost laughed. That's it? Your divine wisdom is clean your house? Sometimes divine wisdom is just remembering to take care of the temple you live in, Jesus replied, eyes crinkling with humor. Both the physical one and the spiritual one. The boat was closer now. Thomas could almost make out the figure standing in it. One more thing, Jesus said. Forgiveness isn't a single act. It's a practice. Some days will be harder than others. Like carrying a weight that never gets lighter, Thomas said, remembering Keanu's words. You just get stronger at carrying it. Jesus nodded. Exactly like that. The boat touched the edge of the dock. The dream began to blur at the edges, colors running together like watercolors in rain. Will I see you again? Thomas asked, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. I'm always closer than you think, Jesus said, and his voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Thomas woke with a gasp, sunlight streaming through blinds he'd forgotten to close. His pillow was wet with tears, his chest aching like he'd run a marathon. For a moment he lay perfectly still, trying to hold on to the dream as it already began slipping away from him. Not all of it. He remembered the dock, the lake, the conversation, the way forgiveness had been offered for something he hadn't even acknowledged needing forgiveness for. His phone showed 7:15 a.m. He'd slept through his first alarm, something that hadn't happened in years. Outside, a garbage truck rumbled past, Monday morning in full swing. Thomas sat up slowly, running a hand through his hair. The dream lingered like the scent of rain after a storm, both present and already fading. But something else remained. Something solid in his chest where for 3 years there had only been hollow pain. A question. A possibility. What if he didn't have to carry this alone anymore? Thomas reached for his phone and pulled up the video from last night. Keanu talking about grief. The ones who love us will miss us, the actor said again, his eyes reflecting a depth of experience that Thomas now felt connected to in some inexplicable way. The words hit differently this morning. They weren't just about death anymore. They were about life. The life still waiting to be lived. Thomas sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen without really seeing it. 3 days had passed since the dream and he couldn't shake it. The images kept floating back to him at odd moments. The lake, the sunlight on water, the conversation that had felt more real than anything he'd experienced in years. You okay there, Tom? Doug was standing in his doorway, concern etched on his face. Thomas blinked, returning to the present. Yeah, just thinking. About the Henderson project. Because they called again. No, not work. The words came out before Thomas could stop them. Doug's eyebrows shot up. In 3 years, Thomas had never admitted to thinking about anything but work during office hours. Want to grab coffee? Take a break? Normally, Thomas would decline. Today, he found himself nodding. Sure. 10 minutes later, they sat in the cafe across the street, steam rising from their cups. Thomas wrapped his hands around the warm ceramic, feeling strangely vulnerable. So, Doug said, not work. Thomas took a breath. I had this dream the other night. He didn't tell Doug everything, nothing about Jesus or the specific conversation. Just that he'd had an unusually vivid dream about forgiveness, about Lily, about letting go. Doug listened without interrupting, which surprised Thomas. When he finished, Doug was quiet for a moment. You know, Doug finally said, my mom was really into dream interpretation. She always said dreams were our subconscious trying to tell us something we already know but aren't ready to hear. Thomas nodded, turning the idea over in his mind. Was that all it was? His brain finally forcing him to confront what therapists had been suggesting for years? Maybe, he said. But it felt different, like he struggled to find the words. Like someone reached inside and rearranged my insides. Doug didn't laugh at the strange description. You going to do anything about it? That was the question Thomas had been asking himself for 3 days. The dream Jesus had given him specific instructions. Clean his house. Call Lily's parents, open the box of photos. Maybe, he said again. That night, Thomas stood in his bedroom closet, staring at a cardboard box pushed far back in the corner. He hadn't opened it since packing it away 2 weeks after the funeral. Inside were all the photos that had once decorated their home. Pictures of their wedding, their honeymoon in Hawaii, weekend trips to the mountains, Moments of a happiness so complete it had become unbearable to look at after she was gone. His hands trembled as he pulled the box forward. Dust had gathered on the lid. He brushed it away, then sat on the edge of the bed, box in his lap. Okay, he whispered to himself. One step at a time. He lifted the lid. The first photo was one he'd forgotten about. Lily on their back porch, hair wild in the wind, laughing at something off camera. Thomas remembered taking it. She'd been telling him about a patient at the pediatric clinic where she worked. A little boy who'd solemnly informed her that he was actually a robot, sent from the future to protect humanity from evil squirrels. A laugh escaped Thomas, surprising him. For so long, memories had brought only pain. But this one brought a smile first, the ache following after like an echo. He set the photo aside and reached for another. Hours passed as Thomas went through the box. Some photos made him cry. Others made him laugh. By the time he reached the bottom, tissues were scattered across the bed, but he felt lighter somehow, as if he'd been carrying these memories like stones in his pockets, weighing him down, when they could have been buoying him up all along. The dream's words came back to him. Your pain honors her, but it was never meant to replace her. Thomas picked up his phone and pulled up YouTube. He searched for Keanu Reeves interviews again, but this time with purpose. He found a longer sit-down from a few years back, one where the interviewer had actually given Keanu space to speak instead of rushing to the next question. People often think of grief as something separate from love, Keanu was saying. But I've come to think of it as just another expression of love. It's love with nowhere to go. Thomas paused the video, struck by the phrase, love with nowhere to go. Yes, that was exactly it. This overwhelming feeling that kept building up inside him with no release, no recipient. He unpaused, listening as Keanu continued. So you find new channels for it. New ways to express it. It doesn't stop the missing, but it gives purpose to the pain. New channels. Thomas looked down at the photos spread across his bed. For 3 years, he'd tried to dam up his love for Lily, to contain it in a box pushed to the back of a closet. No wonder it hurt so much. It was like trying to stop a river with his bare hands. The next morning, Thomas woke early. He showered, shaved, and put on a clean shirt, small actions that somehow felt significant. On his way to work, he stopped at a hardware store and bought paint samples. The walls of his house had needed a fresh coat for years. At lunch, he sat at his desk with his turkey sandwich, but instead of working through emails, he opened his contacts and scrolled to P. Lily's parents' number stared back at him. He hadn't spoken to them in over 2 years, not since an awkward Christmas dinner where everyone had tried too hard to act normal and ended up feeling worse. He'd sent a card last Christmas with a gift card enclosed. They'd sent a thank you text. That was it. His thumb hovered over the call button. What would he even say? Before he could overthink it, he pressed call and held the phone to his ear. It rang 4 times. Thomas was about to hang up when a voice answered. Hello? Lily's mother. Her voice still reminded him so much of her daughter's. Hi, Helen, it's Thomas. Silence on the other end. Then, Thomas? Is everything all right? He almost laughed at the question. Was anything all right? Had it been really since Lily died? I'm okay, he said. I wanted to call. To see how you and Robert are doing. More silence. He could picture her confusion, her suspicion that something must be wrong for him to reach out after so long. We're managing, she finally said. Robert's arthritis is acting up with the cold weather, but otherwise we're okay. How about you? You sound different, did he? Thomas wasn't sure what she heard in his voice. I've been thinking a lot lately. About Lily, about the past 3 years. Oh, Helen said softly. I miss her, Thomas said, his voice cracking on the words. I miss her so much, Helen. He hadn't meant to say it, hadn't planned this conversation at all. But once the words started, they kept coming. I miss her laugh and the way she always sang in the shower even though she couldn't carry a tune. I miss how she'd get so excited about Christmas that she'd start planning in July. I miss the way she always knew exactly what to say to her patients to make them feel brave. He was crying now, not bothering to hide it. On the other end of the line, he could hear Helen crying too. I miss her too, Helen whispered, every day. They cried together, connected by phone lines and shared grief until gradually the tears subsided. Thomas, Helen said. Would you like to come for dinner on Sunday? Nothing fancy, just pot roast and catching up. A week ago, the invitation would have filled him with dread. Today, it felt like a lifeline. I'd like that, he said. Very much. That evening, Thomas hung one of the photos from the box in his living room. Lily at the beach, arms outstretched to the sun. It hurt to look at it, yes, but it was a clean hurt now. The kind that comes with healing rather than festering. He thought about what dream Jesus had said about forgiveness being a practice, not a single act. Today had been a good day in that practice. Tomorrow might be harder, but for the first time in 3 years, Thomas felt something like hope. Small and fragile as a seedling, but alive. Before bed, he watched one last Keanu interview. The actor was describing a motorcycle ride through the mountains, the feeling of wind and freedom. There's this point, Keanu said, when you come around a bend in the road and suddenly you can see for miles. The valley opening up below you, the sky stretching forever above, and for just a second everything makes sense. Thomas turned off the TV and went to the window. The night was clear, stars visible despite the city lights. Somewhere out there, beyond what he could see or understand, were answers to questions he was just beginning to ask. I'm trying, he whispered to the stars, to Lily, to whoever might be listening. I'm really trying. Sunday came faster than Thomas expected. He stood on Helen and Robert's front porch, a bottle of wine in one hand, a bunch of yellow daisies, Lily's favorites, in the other. His stomach churned with nerves. What if this was a mistake? What if they had nothing to say to each other beyond memories of Lily? Before he could second-guess himself further, the door swung open. Helen stood there, her hair grayer than Thomas remembered, her eyes crinkling with a smile that looked both hopeful and cautious. Thomas, she said, pulling him into a hug that smelled of cinnamon and that familiar laundry detergent Lily had grown up with. Come in, come in. The house looked the same as it always had. Cozy, slightly cluttered, walls covered in family photos. Thomas spotted Lily in many of them. Gangly and gap-toothed at 8, dressed for prom at 17, radiant in her white dress on their wedding day. Once these images would have sent him retreating behind his walls. Today they made him feel like he'd come home. The flowers are beautiful, Helen said, taking them from him. Let me put these in water. Robert emerged from the living room, walking with the careful gait of someone managing pain. His handshake was firm as ever. Though good to see you, son, he said. And Thomas felt something crack open inside him at the word son. After Lily died, he'd worried that he'd lost not just his wife but also her family, these people who had welcomed him so warmly from the beginning. Dinner was simple. As promised, pot roast with potatoes and carrots, fresh rolls and apple pie for dessert. The conversation started awkwardly, with safe topics like work and weather. But as they ate, something shifted. Robert mentioned a fishing trip he and Lily had taken when she was 12, how she'd been determined to catch the biggest fish even though she'd squealed every time she had to bait her hook. Thomas laughed at the image, and suddenly they were all sharing stories about Lily, not carefully, with the pained politeness of the bereaved, but freely, with the joy of people who had loved her well. She was so stubborn, Helen said, shaking her head. Remember when she decided to paint her bedroom black? God, she was what, 15? Robert chuckled. We compromised on one wall. She tried to convince me to paint our living room black too, Thomas added, surprised at how easily the memory came, how it didn't stab quite as sharply as before. By the time they'd finished pie and coffee, 3 hours had passed. Thomas helped clear the dishes, falling into the familiar rhythm he remembered from holiday dinners when Lily was alive. As he was about to leave, Helen pressed something into his hands, a small photo album. These are from before you met her, she explained. Her college years, her semester abroad. I thought you might like to see them. Thomas swallowed hard. Thank you, he managed. This means a lot, Helen squeezed his arm. Come back next Sunday? I'm making lasagna. Outside in his car, Thomas sat for a moment, letting the evening settle around him. He felt drained, but in a good way, like he'd finally used muscles long neglected. He opened the album on his lap, flipping through photos of a younger Lily, standing before the Eiffel Tower laughing with college friends, her hair shorter than he'd ever seen it. He'd never known this version of her. There were so many stories he'd never heard, so many parts of her life he'd never asked about during their 7 years together. The realization hit him with unexpected force. His grief had been focused on what he had lost, not celebrating everything that had been. At home, Thomas placed the album on his coffee table and sat on the couch, suddenly exhausted. He closed his eyes just for a moment. When he opened them again, he was back at the lake. This time he wasn't surprised to find himself there, or to see Jesus sitting beside him on the dock. The dream felt like a continuation of a conversation merely paused, not ended. "You went to dinner," Jesus said. It wasn't a question. Thomas nodded. "It was good. Hard, but good. The hardest things often are." Jesus skipped a stone across the water. 1, 2, 3, 4 bounces before it sank. "I saw pictures of her I'd never seen before," Thomas said. "From before I knew her." Jesus nodded. "And what did that show you?" Thomas thought about it. "That I didn't know everything about her. That there were parts of her life, her story, that I never got to hear." He paused. "And that I never will now." "Does that make what you did share less meaningful?" "No," Thomas said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "No, it makes it more precious." They sat in comfortable silence, watching dragonflies hover over the water. The light was different this time, late afternoon instead of morning, golden and rich. "Why does Keanu keep coming up?" Thomas finally asked. "In our first conversation, you mentioned him. And I keep finding, I don't know, answers or comfort in his interviews." Jesus smiled. "Sometimes wisdom comes from unexpected places. His path has not been easy. He speaks truth from experience, not theory." He turned to look at Thomas directly. "And perhaps you needed to hear these things from someone other than a dream." Thomas laughed softly. "You saying I wouldn't have listened if it was just you?" "Would you have?" It was a fair question. 3 years of well-meaning friends and therapists had tried to tell Thomas variations of the same message. He'd nodded and thanked them and gone right back to his isolated grief. "Probably not," he admitted. Jesus shrugged. "The message matters more than the messenger." Thomas thought about the photos in Helen's album, about the stories shared over dinner, about the box of memories he'd kept hidden away for so long. "I feel like I'm just starting to know her again," he said. "Like I'm remembering the fullness of her, not just the loss of her." "That's exactly right," Jesus said. "Grief narrows our vision. Healing expands it again." The light was changing, the golden glow deepening toward sunset. Thomas sensed their time was growing short. "What happens next?" he asked. "You keep going," Jesus said simply. "You have dinner with her parents again. You paint your walls. You put more photos up. You talk about her with people who knew her. You let yourself remember the joy along with the pain." Thomas nodded slowly. It sounded both utterly simple and terribly difficult. "And when the pain gets too heavy again, because it will, won't it?" Jesus didn't offer false reassurance. "It will. That's when you remember what you know now, that the pain is just love with nowhere to go. So you find somewhere for it to go. How? You'll know when the time comes." The dream was fading now, the edges of the lake blurring, the colors softening. "Will I see you again?" Thomas asked, just as he had before. This time, Jesus' answer was different. "You may not need to." Thomas woke on his couch, neck stiff, the room dark except for the glow of streetlights through the blinds. The album still lay on the coffee table. He checked his phone, just past midnight. Despite the discomfort of sleeping awkwardly on the couch, he felt strangely refreshed. The dream lingered like a friend's voice fading with distance, not gone entirely, just moving away. He made himself get up, brush his teeth, change into proper pajamas before climbing into bed. Small acts of self-care that had once seemed pointless, but now felt like quiet promises to himself. The next morning, Thomas woke earlier than usual. Instead of rushing through his routine, he made real breakfast. Eggs and toast, orange juice, coffee in a mug that wasn't stained with months of use. After eating, he stood in his living room, looking at the walls. The paint samples he'd bought days ago sat unopened on the counter. He picked up his phone, then hesitated before scrolling through his contacts. There was a number he hadn't called in years. He pressed it before he could change his mind. "Valley Community Center," a cheerful voice answered. "Hi," Thomas said. "I'm calling about volunteer opportunities. I think I read that you have a grief support group." 20 minutes and one conversation later, Thomas had signed up to attend the next meeting. Not to lead or share, he wasn't ready for that, but to simply be there, to listen, to witness other people's journeys through loss. At work, Doug noticed something different right away. "You look..." "Wake," he said when Thomas walked in. Thomas smiled. "I feel awake. Maybe for the first time in 3 years." That afternoon, an email arrived from a film distribution company. They were doing a special screening of Keanu Reeves's new documentary, a project where the actor had interviewed people about their experiences with grief and healing. The premiere was next month at a theater downtown. Thomas stared at the email, which had been sent to everyone at his firm because they'd designed the renovation for the theater. It felt too perfect to be coincidence, yet too specific to be chance. "Everything happens for a reason," Lily used to say when plans fell through or unexpected opportunities arose. Thomas had never been sure if he believed that. But maybe some things did happen exactly when you needed them. He clicked going on the RSVP button, then turned back to his work, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. 6 months later, Thomas stood before Lily's grave with fresh flowers in his hands. The cemetery was quiet this morning, dew still clinging to the grass, birds singing from nearby trees. He knelt and brushed away fallen leaves from the headstone, tracing her name with his fingertips. "Hey, Lil," he said softly. "Sorry it's been a while." It hadn't actually been that long. He'd started visiting monthly instead of just on anniversaries. But this visit felt different. For the first time, he'd come alone, without the crushing weight that had previously made these visits unbearable without someone to lean on. He arranged the flowers in the vase, daisies again, always her favorites, and sat cross-legged on the ground. "The house looks different now," he told her. "Painted the living room that blue you always wanted. Remember how I said it was too bright? You were right. It's perfect." A gentle breeze rustled the trees overhead. Thomas took it as a sign to continue. "I had dinner with your parents again last night. Your dad's arthritis is better with the new medication. Your mom's thinking about getting a dog, can you believe it? After all those years saying no to you about puppies." He smiled at the memory of Lily bringing home shelter dog brochures, making her case like a lawyer presenting evidence. Helen had always been firm, no dogs. Now she talked about rescue poodles with the enthusiasm of a convert. "The grief group is going well," Thomas continued. "I'm not just listening anymore, I'm actually talking. Sharing our story." He paused. "Our whole story, not just the sad ending." The support group had become a surprising anchor in his life. Every Tuesday evening he sat in a circle with other people who understood loss in a way no one else could. They talked about their loved ones, about the complexity of grief, about how healing wasn't linear but looped back on itself in unexpected ways. Last month, he'd finally shared the dream about Jesus at the lake. He'd been nervous, it sounded bizarre, maybe even sacrilegious to some. But people had nodded, many with tears in their eyes. Some shared their own unexplainable experiences. Vivid dreams, familiar scents appearing out of nowhere, birds that seemed to follow them, coincidences too perfect to be chance. Ways they'd found meaning in their pain. "Oh, and the documentary screening was amazing," Thomas said to the headstone. Keanu was actually there in person. Did a Q&A afterward. The theater had been packed that night. Thomas sat alone, though Helen and Robert had offered to come. The documentary was beautiful. Honest interviews with people who had endured profound loss, interwoven with Keanu's own reflections. Nothing sentimental or preachy, just raw human experience presented with compassion and dignity. Afterward, people had lined up to ask questions. Thomas hadn't planned to speak but somehow found himself at the microphone. "How do you know when you're healing?" he'd asked. "When grief is changing into something else?" Keanu had considered the question carefully before answering. "I don't think we ever really know in the moment," he'd said. "It's like watching a sunrise. You can't pinpoint exactly when night becomes day. You just look up at some point and realize the light has changed." The answer had stayed with Thomas for weeks. He'd written it down in the journal he'd started keeping, another suggestion from the dream that had unexpectedly enriched his life. "I think my light is changing," Thomas told Lily now. "I'm not sure when it started. Maybe that first dream. Maybe when I finally opened our photos. Maybe when I called your mom. But it's different now." The sun had risen higher, warming his back. Thomas closed his eyes, feeling the light on his skin. "I still miss you every day," he said. "That hasn't changed. I don't think it ever will. But it doesn't feel like drowning anymore." He stayed a while longer, telling Lily about work, about her old friend Penny who'd reached out after hearing Thomas was doing better, about the stray cat that had started visiting his back porch. Just ordinary things, shared the way he would have if she were sitting across the kitchen table. When he finally stood to leave, his legs were stiff, but his heart felt light. He pressed his fingers to his lips, then to her name on the stone. "I'll be back soon," he promised. That evening, Thomas hosted the monthly dinner he'd started having at his house. Helen and Robert, Doug and his wife, a few people from the grief group who had become friends. The house that had been silent for so long now regularly filled with conversation and laughter. Thomas moved around his kitchen, putting finishing touches on the meal. The walls were freshly painted, photos hung in new frames, windows clean and letting in the sunset light. The house felt alive again. After everyone had gone home and the dishes were washed, Thomas sat on his back porch with a cup of tea. The stray cat appeared as if on cue, settling cautiously on the step below him. "Hey there," he said softly. The cat blinked at him, keeping its distance but not running away. Progress. Thomas hadn't had another dream about the lake since that second visit. Sometimes he missed it, the clarity of those conversations, the peace of that place. But more often he felt the essence of those messages in his waking life. In moments of unexpected joy, in new connections with people, in memories of Lily that made him smile instead of wince. He thought about what dream Jesus had said about forgiveness being a practice. It was true. Some days were still hard. Holidays, birthdays, random Tuesdays when grief ambushed him without warning. On those days, he had to consciously choose again to forgive himself. To remember that his last words to Lily weren't the sum of their love story. The cat stretched and moved closer, nearly within petting distance now. "You're getting braver," Thomas told it. His phone buzzed with a text from Helen. "Thanks for dinner. Robert says your lasagna is getting better." High praise from an Italian. Thomas smiled and typed back a response. These small exchanges, normal, everyday connections, had once seemed impossible. Now they were becoming routine. Each one a tiny victory. Inside, on his bookshelf, sat a framed quote from Keanu Reeves that Thomas had handwritten and placed beside his favorite photo of Lily. "Grief changes shape, but it never ends." People have a misconception that you can deal with it and say, "It's gone, and I'm better." They're wrong. The words that had once felt like a life sentence now read like permission to carry his love for Lily forward without expecting the missing to ever completely stop. To find joy again without betraying her memory. Thomas thought about the lake sometimes, wondered if he would ever return there in his dreams. Part of him hoped he would. Another part understood that perhaps he didn't need to anymore. The path forward wasn't about leaving grief behind. It was about letting it change shape, letting it soften from a jagged stone to a smooth river rock. Still there, still real, but no longer cutting him with every movement. Next week, he would start volunteering at the children's hospital where Lily had worked. The director had been surprised when Thomas called, but quickly found a place for him reading to kids in the long-term care ward. It felt right. A way to honor Lily's compassion for children, to give that love somewhere to go. The cat finally let Thomas stroke its head, purring softly before darting away into the darkness. Thomas smiled. Trust took time. Healing took time. Everything worth doing took time. He went inside and closed the door, turning on just enough lights to keep the house from feeling empty. On his nightstand sat the journal where he recorded not just memories of Lily, but moments of grace in his ongoing journey. The first time he'd laughed without feeling guilty. The day he'd finally cleaned out her closet and donated her clothes. The morning he'd woken up and reached for her only to find that the automatic ache had dulled to a gentle sadness. Small victories. Tiny resurrections. As he got ready for bed, Thomas caught his reflection in the bathroom mirror. He looked different, the haunted expression gone from his eyes, replaced by something quieter, more peaceful. Not happiness exactly, but the potential for it, a readiness. "The light has changed," he said to his reflection, remembering Keanu's words about the sunrise, and it had. Not in a blinding flash, but gradually, imperceptibly, one small choice at a time. Until Thomas looked up and realized that somehow, when he wasn't watching, day had broken through the longest night of his life.